I was standing there like I was 9 years old in the hall of my grade school. It was a typical hot Texas day, but somehow I was feeling so cool. And I felt a little breeze. I felt a small draft. And I turned around to hear all my friends laugh. And when I looked down, it nearly blew my head. I had left all my clothes at home on my bed. Well, what was I to do? I had to get to class. Just my Dukes of Hazzard lunchbox covering my... Oh, thank God that it wasn't true. Wasn't in the 3rd grade in my birthday suit. Now, I don't know what all this is supposed to mean, but I just thank God it was just a dream. So these are actually, this was actually a song that I wrote several years ago, probably, I want to say 2010, so 14 years ago. 2 years later, I would learn about a concept, and then 10 years later after that, I would learn that that concept was represented in this dream that I just wrote about. And that concept is toxic shame. And so in the book, Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw, he talks about how these dreams, which I think probably everyone, if I did a raise of hands, everyone here has probably experienced where you're showing up somewhere and you ain't got no clothes. And the verse that follows, also similar, which is that dream where I'm in college, it's my final exam, never been to class, have no idea, that one, also related to toxic shame. So I did not know that I was writing about my toxic shame in a way. And so since I have practiced a lot of what I'm going to share with you today, I was thinking today, I was reflecting, I don't have those dreams much anymore. I have other dreams, obviously, and I have them periodically, but not as frequently as I do. So I think it's a sign that this process does work a little bit. So I'm going to review first my last talk, which, by the way, is on your resource sheet there. There's a link. I uploaded it today, which I called Slow Burn, and I was addressing primarily burnout, which I said is a slow burn because often it's happening so quickly and slowly that we may not even realize we're in it. But what is really going on, what's good about burnout is that I believe it's become a bit of a safe word to say something like it's a way for people in the workforce or wherever to say, hey, you know, I'm struggling a little bit. I'm not happy at work. I'm struggling at work. Maybe I need help. Whatever they're saying, it's kind of a safe way. It's not, we don't have to jump with both feet into the I'm mentally ill circle. We can say something with a little safety. So I think it's a good word in that way that's come about. And what's maybe not so good about burnout is that, and the WHO is kind of contributing to this a little bit, is that, it's about work. You know, it's not, the WHO has kind of defined it as like, this only exists in the workplace, or this is only regarding work, which is kind of obvious for any of us who might know a little bit about mental health. It's not going to just happen in one place. So I'm a little bummed about that. And that's the risk that we run of using the term burnout, is that, you know, and really the risk of anything is that we say, well, this is the problem, you know, work is the problem, my marriage is the problem, and we get, you know, I'm burnt out in my marriage, and the marriage, you know, whereas the big focus of what I want to talk about, and what I talked about a little bit last time, is that it's not as much the circumstances as the chronic problem. And Dr. Gabor Mate, who I'm going to quote a few times possibly, at least once, he talks about stress not as something circumstantial, but as something chronic. So we like to look at things and say this is the problem, but often it's more than that. And so deep under that is anxiety, possibly, and possibly some depression. And these could be in their mild form. One could be mild, one could be moderate, they could be severe, they could be all over the place. But oftentimes, if we look at the symptoms of burnout, even by the WHO, and also the Mayo Clinic is a great resource on this, there's a lot of crossover. And one bottom line, like easy one to see, is that one of the signs of depression is we don't enjoy some of the things that once brought us pleasure. Now, we may never, if you're a little bit like me, when I first went into dentistry, we may have never enjoyed it. And so that's a big problem, burnout. But sometimes it is that, hey, I expected to get some fulfillment of from this, or I used to get some fulfillment and now I'm not. That's just a basic sign of depression. And there are many others. Even the Mayo Clinic lists things like upset stomach and insomnia, big time representations of and symptoms of anxiety as well. So that may be going on. Self-esteem is an issue in it. Looked at, the most glaring, and this is another great kind of safe word thing that's come out, and it leans directly about what I want to talk about today, about shame and toxic shame. It's this imposter syndrome. This is a great word. People are talking about it a lot. And I had it about 3 minutes ago when I was walking up the hallway to come here. So it happens. It's always happening. And it's the statistics are huge. It's like up to 80% of people will say that I have this. And so it's a great reflection. Again, the danger we can fall into is that's because of work. I need to change work. And the approach that I'm going to speak about is looking beyond that, deeper than that, older than that. So these are all really based in fear. And that could be surprising to you, could be obvious when we think of anxiety. You may or may not know anxiety, basically heightened fear. Anxiety, a response of our sympathetic nervous system, our reptilian brain. So things are reacting in that way. Fear, I'm losing my track here. So this went really well when I practiced it the other day and there were no people in the room. But yeah, these are all based in fear. And fear, that sympathetic nervous system response, elevated cortisol, elevated stress hormone, and that's what causes a lot of that, that insomnia that I talked about. Can cause that upset stomach and could cause physical health problems. Where I linked, it snapped for me when I was preparing the first talk with depression. It would seem that if sympathetic response is fight, flight, or freeze, that depression is likely a form of that. It could be a form of that freeze. So where it's like our bodies and everything else is saying, okay, I'm shutting down. This is too much. We're trying too hard here, and I need a rest and a break. And with fear, like I said, these all have early origins. So first quote, as I said, from Dr. Gabor Mate. If you're not familiar with him, he is a doctor, a Hungarian doctor based out of Canada, trained in Canada. And he's worked in addiction. He worked in one of the most concentrated drug abuse areas in Canada for a while. He's advocated against, I won't get into all that, but he's an amazing man and has a big focus on the whole of our trauma, of our childhoods. So he says virtually everything I saw, whether it was cancer, MS, depression, addiction, ADHD, colitis, arthritis, you know what it came down to? It came down to what happened in people's childhoods. It's a very profound statement. So the solution that I talked about last time, and a lot of this will cross over for today, so a little bit of a spoiler, but that's okay because we're going to cross it over into shame, is that the solution is experiential. So it's something that we have to go through. We can't just learn things and all of a sudden the problem is gone. There is a learning. There has to be both. There's a learning. There needs to be an awareness. There needs to be new knowledge. There needs to be a new thinking a lot of times. If anyone is familiar with 12-step work, we know that we often say that we have a thinking problem. And so there does need to be a new thinking, but there also needs to be this a right-brained or feeling-brained approach that we have to go through in order to experience healing and progress in these areas. So cognitive alone won't do it. And the bad news about that is you got to go through it. The good news is we're going to go through it. So there's not much of a choice for us. But this is something I spoke about where we want to get, it's pretty obvious, we want to get out of our anxiety And if we're suffering with maybe with some depression, we want to get out of that. And there are ways to do that. And those ways might be the common suggestions you hear. And when I look on burnout sites, this is what I see. General things like, we might want to do some therapy. That might be more on the second part. But meditation, exercise, taking care of ourselves, eating right, getting enough sleep, these practical ways that we get out of anxiety might include medication for some of us. But what I want to talk about mostly is getting into these things. And what I mean by that is by being curious about them. So if we're only trying to get out of them, we're neglecting the heart, the roots of the problem. And if we're not curious about it and exploring those roots and getting to the heart, I believe, and I've witnessed in my own life, the heart's going to win. The heart's going to win. Because I've done a lot of things to get out of my anxiety. Some reasonably healthy, because there's those other ways we can get out. And a lot of us here have maybe tried some of those, alcohol, sex, overworking, whatever. Even the healthy ones, exercise, just do it a little bit more and I'll get out of my anxiety. But if we don't get into it, we won't have a lasting solution and lasting results and lasting progress. The heart will win. It wants to be heard and known. So also important, as I said, it was all fear-based, so we want to identify the fears. And I talk about that a little bit in the last, and you can listen to that. The Enneagram is a great resource to look at some core fears. So when I first started doing some fear work, I was listing out seemingly concrete things that I was afraid of. Okay, I'm afraid this might happen. I'm afraid these people won't like me. I'm afraid my business, won't, kind of, like I said, almost like those circumstantial things like I was talking about with the stressors. And what I didn't realize is underneath that we have big psychological fears, we have big emotional fears, and we have big spiritually linked fears. And so that is a whole nother level that I think we need to get to. Because we can say we're afraid of spiders, and then we can play the and then what game. And then what? Well, are we afraid we're going to be harmed? Are we afraid we're not going to be healthy? Are we afraid we're not going to be taken care of? So, and those are some big fears for me. And then listen to others. We often don't know our own stories until we hear someone else tell them. This has been my experience. I was adopted at birth, and I didn't really start having any feelings about my adoption until I heard a gentleman start to speak out about his home that he grew up in. And he wasn't adopted, but he had enough of similar feelings that it allowed my heart to start melting and say, oh, I think I'm feeling some of this. So listening to others is big, because if we've never known these things, if we've never had this thought process, it's kind of hard to just generate out of nowhere sometimes. And then feeling. We need to feel. So we'll do the same thing we did last time. I'm going to lead you guys in a little exercise. These are the 8 core feelings. And these were written by Chip Dodd. Obviously, he didn't create them. but he compiled this list. And, if you look at feelings, there can be dozens or hundreds. I found that it's very helpful. There's not much that I'm feeling that can't be put into one of these 8 words. And so it's a really simple way of just checking in with ourselves, checking in with our heart, and seeing what we're feeling. So what I'm going to do now, and we're going big time. I've got music and everything. So on cue. All right. So what we'll do, we're going to do this is the only experiential thing I'm going to do tonight. But let's take some quiet time. We're going to close our eyes, and if you want to, you can put your hand on your heart and take a couple breaths. And if this list is new to you, or even if it's not, obviously you might need to glance at the list. And here's what I want to invite you to do, is just to think about and check in with yourself about just which of these you're feeling right now. And there's a couple things I want to say before I give you some silence. And one is, it could have to do with yesterday, 10 years ago, today, or even tomorrow. Doesn't matter, it's okay. And secondly, I want to approach these feelings without judgment. Don't worry about why you're feeling them. If you think you might be feeling them, that's it. That's all we need. That's all we need to know for now. And lastly, if you're feeling, one of them is glad, I invite you to take a couple breaths and see if there's anything else, because often when we feel gladness, we think that must be it. That's all I can feel. I feel glad. But part of this way of life is to see that we can experience several feelings at once. So let me give you a minute of silence and check in with yourself. If you want to, you can jot down on paper what feelings those are. Well, you may not be experiencing them as much as me, but I'm definitely feeling some fear and shame up here. And I talked about fear being the underlying root or core or cause, if you want to say it, of those burnout symptoms or burnout. What's underneath the burnout? We got the burnout, we got the anxiety, then we got the fear. So the underlying core, well, what does shame have to do with fear? And it seems to have a lot to do with it. It's shame's the number one fear fertilizer, and really vice versa, which I'll talk about in a minute. But nothing grows our fear quite like shame. Now, there is, so this was a part of my story I told last time. If you want to see what the intense effects of shame can do, and fear. So this isn't the actual picture. I didn't get a picture of it, but many years ago, in a fit of rage, I punched out the windshield of my pickup truck. It looked about like this, not quite as bad. So I learned pretty soon after that was fear-based. Months later, I would piece together that there was a ton of shame in that moment. Specifically, my wife at the time was upset with me. My son was upset because I was asking for help for something. And in this moment, I felt like if I was a good husband, I wouldn't have this person upset with me, and my son wouldn't be upset. And it ended up, I didn't even really need help, because by the time I got here, we were already close, and I was just trying to, and it was just, I felt so much shame, and the fear was that God didn't care about me. If God cared about me, I'd be a good husband. And if I was a good husband, this person wouldn't be upset. And that's how viscerally scary this got for me, and how real it got is, this is the only option that I had. It wasn't something I thought through. It was almost an out-of-body experience. So this is how powerful it can get, and rage is another one of those symptoms of anxiety, by the way. Rage, not as much based in anger as we think, rage being primarily fear, with a little pinch of salt of anger, like a pinch of salt in the cookie dough. There is such a thing called healthy shame. Now, some people don't think this is true. Some people might just call it more of a guilt, and a lot of words out there for all these things. But let me show you what I found of healthy shame for myself, and with the help of Chip Dodd and Phil Herndon, who's another counselor of mine, who's excellent. Healthy shame for me has shown that it says I'm limited. I'm limited and I need help. I don't have all the answers. I may have what it takes to do this, but I may not. I'm limited. I'm human. And so healthy shame also, this is the little bit of that guilt factor. Healthy shame might say, I may have hurt you. Hey, I may have hurt you. I feel some shame. And it can repair a relationship in that way. It can say, I made a mistake. So again, a little bit of the guilt factor. What I'll point out is I believe there's a healthy fear in all of these. If I'm limited, I'm going to feel a little, hey, I'm afraid I'm limited. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to accomplish this task or have what it takes to do this. I'm afraid I might need some help. I'm afraid I might have hurt you. I'm afraid I made a mistake. So I think there's a healthy fear, and so that's where I think shame and fear are very much tied together. Now, toxic shame creates more of a story about us. Toxic shame says something about us, whereas healthy shame keeps us a little more focused on others, our community, our relationship. Toxic shame just starts writing a story about us, like me in that pickup truck. I'm too, fill in the blank, too needy, too stupid. Another way of saying the same thing, I'm not blank enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not organized enough. If I was organized enough, I wouldn't have had to make that call and get help. So fill in the blanks. Or just a flat out label. I'm an idiot. I'm a fool. This is a good question from toxic shame. What is wrong with me? That's what I started my talk with last time. I definitely had that. Now there's some health to some of these things where we're reflecting, and if we have severe anxiety or depression, we might have something wrong with us. But there's a difference between an illness and a permanently flawed state of our being. So that's the difference. This is a part of me that I've lived with most of my life. Ikdar, I can't do anything right. He's one of my parts I grew up with, and he shows up every now and then still. My friends that I played tennis with when I was young saw him a lot, along with several broken or bent tennis rackets. And it's kind of funny because we can, I'm going to talk later about we don't want to shame ourselves for having shame or shame ourselves for having fear. But it is I can kind of chuckle with my shame about how grandiose it gets. I mean, that's a pretty grandiose thing. I can't do anything right. I'm the only human in the whole world who never does anything right. So it's pretty grandiose. So the originating fear of shame is, do I belong and do I matter? That's what we want to know. Chip Dodd says this is our most basic and most important need that we have. Do I belong and do I matter? So we start looking to have this question answered, and that's where shame begins. Toxic shame, this is David Tyner, who some of us may know, and former dentist, by the way, now therapist. He said that toxic shame is not a real feeling, that it's basically just fear with different words on it. So there's no actual feeling, whereas those 8 core feelings, we might be able to say, hey, this is an actual feeling, like this is coming from my heart. He proposes that toxic shame is just fear with different words on it. So if that's true, let's see if I have this in here. So if we're feeling shame, what are we actually feeling? We're feeling fear. And again, we might be having that sympathetic nervous system response. And so we're feeling that rush in cortisol and those physical symptoms. When I experience shame, especially if I'm in a group of people, my cheeks start to go a little numb. And these are things that as we look into these feelings and look into our fears, we'll start to notice it in our bodies because it's a response of fear for our bodies. So, and then I feel shame a lot in my neck too. But what we're basically experiencing is the same symptoms a lot of times as anxiety. So sympathetic nervous system feeling. So you can say I feel, and it's profound. It's less unique than the other feelings, but I've been in groups with guys when I was early in this process, and God, I felt so much shame. I just wanted to crawl under the table where no one could see me. So to say that's not a feeling, but what is that? That's fear. I want to hide. I want to flight. I want to fly away. I want to run. Thankfully, I never wanted to fight anybody, I don't think. So this is what we're experiencing is fear. And this is one of the issues. This is one of the dilemmas. Is it's a cycle. It begins with that healthy fear of do I, and that question, do I belong and do I matter? And we feel that in our heart because we're made to experience that relationship, that belonging, that mattering. Unfortunately, our mind starts to take over, and we look for cues if that's true or not. And our mind grasps onto the cues that say, no, you don't. No, I don't think you do. And in turn, it creates more fear. And every time we come around this cycle, we're like that, just a cell phone looking for a signal. And over time, we start to become hypervigilant. And what's amazing to me, and what's really saddens me, is that I believe we all get enough. I believe we all have to get some indicators that we belong and we matter. But it's also quite obvious, unfortunately, that shame seems to kind of trump because of where we all end up in shame and how much of a problem it causes us. So I think our shame really makes us forget because it holds on, our mind takes over and holds on to those moments that say, no, I don't think you belong. No, you're not like everybody else. And that's a very difficult pattern to get into. And we start getting hypervigilant, constantly looking for cues. And then we go into things. So we need a way out to stop the cycle. And we find plenty of ways, like I talked about earlier. Medicators, alcohol, work, success, and they work for a while. Like we say in 12-step meetings, until they stop working. And so we need something else that works more permanently and more consistently. So shame and fear were not grown in a vacuum. These originated early on, like Gabor Mate says, even about the physical conditions. Same thing with the emotional part of those physical conditions. They were not grown in a vacuum. They originated in our childhood, and I want to encourage us to look for those places where that happened. So how are they paths to peace? How are shame and fear paths to peace? I believe they're paths to peace because they are paths to grief. If we go down that trail that they will lead us on, we can find grief. And I feel like that is the solution that is lasting to get us out of this cycle. We still need those other things, the healthy ones, to get us out of here. We still need medication sometimes. We still need meditation, which is what I was planning on saying right there. Medication and meditation possibly. We still need exercise. We still need the healthy things. We need affirmation of others. We might need to affirm ourselves. We need all those things, but without giving weight to our hearts, there's the origin of these issues and where they might have originated, we'll continue in the cycle. Those other things will likely stop working. So what exactly am I proposing that we grieve? And this is where we get to the practical. This is where I was shown to start, is to take the top 5 to 10 most painful events in our lives. Pretty light start, right? Just dive right in. And I was asked to write about half a paragraph on each of these. I think it's important to, I don't know if I wrote that down, but yeah, it was important. It was stressed to me to pay attention to the feelings that surround these events, like I said, because I could easily write what happened, but I couldn't necessarily write how I felt about it. I had to really sit with that. And speaking of sitting, that's to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail. When we look at that pattern and that cycle and getting out of it, we want to stay active. That's really part of it is we want to stay active because that keeps us out of it. But a big part of, I think, the more permanent and lasting solution is to slow down and to sit with these feelings. So when we do this, if we choose to do this, top 5 to 10 most painful, it's good to list out the feelings and sit with them and actually write them down. And I will do a quick note of a study. If you watch the first presentation, you'll hear this, but I'll go ahead and share it with you because I love this study. It was a book called Opening Up, and I'll forget the guy's name because I wasn't planning on mentioning it, but he did a study where he had some college students write about a traumatic event. The first group wrote what happened, the second group wrote how they felt about it, and the third group wrote what happened and how they felt about it. And the third group showed the most significant reduction in anxiety. So that's just a testament to, it is important to know and to have what happened, but it's also equally as important to know how we felt about it. And this is the question I also, if you were at the first presentation, I gave you some homework that you might have done with this. I suggested doing this around a fearful situation or a situation that caused a lot of agitation for you, basically any big feeling. And today I'll propose kind of the same, but today I'll propose that you do it around something maybe that carries a lot of shame. Maybe a time you were very embarrassed, or just wait for it, meaning pay attention to your heart over the next few days and find a situation where you're like, I had a lot of feelings about that and there wasn't really much that happened, where you get a little curious about yourself. And then you can ask this question. This I find is one of the most profound questions I've been shown over the last few years. What's the earliest I remember feeling this way? And this is the nice thing, this is a progressive question, like what we remember today is the earliest. It may be far earlier tomorrow, or we might remember one that was a little later tomorrow or the next day or a week or a year from now. So this process never ends. And it's a beautiful process of getting in touch with our fear and our shame and where. These are the follow-up questions. What's the earliest I remember feeling this way? What happened? What did I feel, as I said before? Who was there? And this is one of the biggest ones. What changed? Because that's where the loss is. And a lot of these wounds will have happened with our parents, caregivers, or some authority figures when we were young. And the loss is where the relationship changed as a result of this event. So a trauma is one thing, and there may have been a trauma where there wasn't a big change in a relationship, but most of the time in these big events, the relationship will have changed, and often there will be a loss. And I'll talk more about what types of loss in a minute. But when I started counseling, when I was really struggling at the beginning of this whole process for me, this was actually before the windshield event. When I started counseling, I started talking about my granddad abusing me, which interestingly enough was when I was 9 years old. And you probably don't remember this, but the lyrics that I was quoting at the beginning said I was standing there like I was 9 years old. And I was not talking about my granddad's abuse when I wrote that song. So that's how powerful the heart is. So I'm talking with my counselor about my granddad's abuse, and he starts talking about my granddad being an authority figure. And I said, I don't really see my granddad as an authority figure. And he said, how can you not? Like, he's your grandfather. And that was the first tear that day first tears. And it was probably more like one tear. I was just starting. That was the first tear I shed about my granddad's abuse and the change in our relationship. I realized I had lost my relationship with him as an authority figure in my life. And that was the crack in the dam, because many tears followed after that, very specifically around that event. So a lot changed in that day. I got the music going. I was going to do an experiential thing here, but I had some thoughts about it, and I'm going to more just kind of talk you through it to let you either do this on your own. And one of the reasons I'm not doing it is it's a pretty big deal. And I did some of it last time, and this may be something you want to do with a counselor or a therapist. But as we picture these, think about these events that happened, where the shame and fear originated, who was there, where we were, what did it smell like, what did it look like, what was the light like coming in through the windows. It's a big deal if you haven't traveled that direction before. So this process here is a way of doing it where we're not just thinking about the events, but we're seeing ourselves. What I was going to lead you in today is just starting to approach our inner children without judgment. And what I mean by that is, if we were to take a minute and close our eyes and we picture our inner child, some of us might feel a lot of joy and gladness. Others might feel some resentment and anger or even a disdain. And what I want to encourage you on is, whatever you feel when you first start this, it's okay. Doesn't mean we're bad people. We may have all kinds of feelings. There's a movie on your resource sheet that I listed called The Kid, and it's with Bruce Willis, and it was actually a Disney movie. And the reason you never heard of it, and I can't believe it was a Disney movie, but the reason we never heard of it is because it's just too true. It's a very accurate picture of how we might relate with our inner children. So I recommend that for you if you get to it. But that's what I was going to walk you through, is just envisioning our inner child and picturing them and approaching them without judgment, however we feel about it. In fact, we can be curious about how we feel about them and where that's coming from. But that's a good step in really connecting, seeing ourselves, and not just seeing the event, but seeing ourselves in it. So we'll leave that to you if you choose to do so. So what are we grieving again? Grieve what? And if there's hurt, if there's one of these events where there's loss and we feel shame and something happened and it had something to do with someone we were supposed to trust, a lot of these events, or whether we just witnessed something traumatic that we almost had nothing to do with, we're going to feel hurt. It's inevitable. And so we might just grieve the hurt, how much it hurts to be in that situation. And my thought, I have inner arguments coming up, thinking, what are these guys thinking about this? So I find what's the inner argument? Well, Keith, if I felt hurt when it happened, wouldn't I have just cried then? And that's the crazy thing about trauma is whether it's a big traumatic event or it's something where we trusted a caregiver and they didn't meet our needs, and it's trauma like that, our heart gets shut down. We just learn to shut it down so quickly and so efficiently that we might have felt this hurt. It might have been for a second. So when I came into this process of doing these things, looking for my grief and beginning to grieve, I mean, I was crying 40 years of tears. And so, I don't know what age I decided, but it was pretty young. I said, I'm done with sadness. I'm not doing that anymore. I've had enough of that. So but in addition to just the hurt, we might have had a loss of safety, physical or emotional. We might have lost our true self, which is kind of another way of saying, we're the same way of saying we lost our inner child in a way. And we might have lost the ideal relationship with that person. And again, inner argument, well, how do I know what an ideal relationship is? So, Hollywood movies, the Bible, I don't know. I mean, I think it's written in our hearts. I think we know what we need when we're babies. And unfortunately, all of our parents were human. And so at some point, one of our caregivers couldn't meet those needs, and even might have given us a dose of shame for having those needs. So we lose that safety, and like I shared with my grandfather, I lost that ideal relationship, what it could have looked like. So a lot of the grief isn't what we lost as much as maybe what we never had. Maybe not as much what we lost as what we never had that we wanted and needed. So that's a lot of things to grieve. It's a lot of things to grieve. A lot of loss. Here's something to grieve, is that toxic shame steals from us. It steals that it's okay to be weak or needy. Toxic shame tells us that we need to be strong and independent and perfect. And healthy shame shows us that it's okay to be weak and needy and human and clumsy. And we've had that stolen, and that's worth grieving. That's worth grieving. So, how do we protect ourselves from sadness in a bad way? Another way to say that might be, how do we run from it? I kind of already talked about this because it's essentially some of the same ways we get out of that cycle. You know, there's the big ones. There's the medicators: alcohol, work, sex, long distance running. That'll only let you run away from it for so long. And then it ends up being pretty therapeutic, but still. But there's small ways, there's just small things that we can say even. A lot of the things that we say, we may not even know we're saying. And this is where I can be a real stickler for words. And Nanette, my wife, will tell you, I'll go round and round with words. I'm a semantics junkie, and it gets pretty annoying. But I think it's worth paying attention to. We don't have to be, again, a perfectionist about it. These things are going to slip out. But I think it's good to notice these small things that we say where we run from sadness. Things like, here's one of the biggest ones. I actually had someone with cancer say this to me today. Well, yeah, it is what it is. I mean, I'm scared for this person, and I'm sad that they have cancer, and I'm angry that they have cancer. And if I were her, I'd probably be saying it is what it is as well. But do you see where I'm going? It's like to sit with, I have cancer and I don't know. It's hard. And it is what it is. Things like that they can cause us to run. Saying, I don't want to complain. That's a big one. Very shame-based. Very shame-based way of running from sadness. I don't want to complain. And this way of life has shown me, with the right people, hey, it's okay to complain. Because we might not be complaining. Who gets to label it that? Shame might label it that. Or people who don't have the emotional capacity to sit with us in our pain and in our sadness might say that. It may not be complaining. It may just be talking about our sadness. And I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to ruin it. I had a good childhood. That's a big one. I feel most fear with people going through this process that might say they had a good childhood, because they probably did. And in a lot of ways, I had a great childhood. And the people that say they have a good childhood have a little tougher time sometimes getting to these traumas, these abandonments, these losses that we all have. I don't want to complain. I had a good childhood. I don't want to ruin it. So, a little bit of a spoiler alert. But is there anyone who has not seen this movie? All right, it's Inside Out. Good. All right. So I'm not spoiling it for anyone. And if I did, the sequel's coming out soon. Very excited about that. But it's a both and. That's the thing. With joy and with sadness. In this movie, you might recall this that she's holding is a memory. And at the beginning of the movie, sadness here on the right kept touching the memories and turning them blue. And joy on the left is like, no, what are you doing? You know, basically you're ruining it. This is a joyful memory, and look what you've done. And we find out in the end of the movies, it's not either or, it's both and. And they could basically swipe these memories and see that around every joyful situation, there was often a sad situation that was happening as well. And that doesn't have to be, again, shame is what wants to label that as bad or complaining or whatever, whereas the truth just says it's both. And it's okay to feel both. One of my favorite phrases that I've come up with in the last few years is the glass isn't half full or half empty. The glass is half full and it's half empty. And just a quick word about tears, and I'm coming to the end here, so I thank you guys for sticking in there with me. Tears are powerful. We all grieve in different ways. You may not have as many tears as I had when I talked about starting that process. I was crying pretty hard every day for about 2 years. And the funny thing about that is it felt so good. I mean, like I said, 40 years of tears, like backlogged. Man, it felt good. And in fact, in some ways, I kind of miss it. It was such a release. And I don't have an easy time crying. I don't need to as much, but also sometimes I do. And I have a hard time finding it. But they're powerful. So we all grieve differently. We may not have as many tears. And how we grieve might be dependent on, the time that we're in, the day, the minute, or the hour. But tears reduce cortisol. Tears actually contain cortisol in them. And I don't know the research behind this, but a friend of mine, Jared, who's a counselor, said that if you are able to cry with others, the amount of cortisol in your tears is actually doubled. I haven't found research on that, so I don't know if it's technically doubled, but I've experienced some of my earliest grief. Marita.
Question, are you saying that the amount of cortisol that is coming out of your body through your tears is doubled?
Is doubled. Yes, sorry. Thank you for having me clarified. And again, I can't be completely quoted on that because I haven't found the research. But like I said, anecdotally, I've experienced grieving with others, and it has been a profound part of my journey. So I believe even if it's not doubled, it's probably increased. But even without that, the fact that the stress hormone is in our tears is pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. And I have this was a big part, I believe, of reducing my anxiety. And I haven't punched a windshield since. And of course, there's the stages of grief. What do we want to grieve for? Reduction in anxiety and shame, opening up. I'm going to skip this part to get to the stages of grief. Stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this is, of course, what we want it to look like. 75 miles an hour. Damn, get to the acceptance, baby. That's more what it looks like.
That's a good graphic.
But here's the thing so like I said, we all grieve differently. We might have different times we spend in each stage. But here's what it gives us permission to do. By the way, these slides are also, they're on your resource sheet there. Yeah. So you can access there's a little QR code that goes through these. But yeah, this is what the stages of grief allows us to do, is just basically feel. So denial and bargaining, big time fear responses. Like, I'm afraid of this sadness, so I'm going to try to either deny it or do something to change it. Can we make a deal? Anger is straight up in there, right there. Probably going to feel some hurt, like I shared before. Depression is going to contain anger. Depression might contain some shame, and likely a lot of loneliness and depression. I talked about that in the last talk as well. And then, of course, we get to acceptance, which is really where the sadness is. And I put glad because we may not be glad about the circumstance we're grieving, but we're going to have joy that we've gotten through it. And I've experienced joy that I've gotten to the grief and to the acceptance. So it may not feel like, good boy, I'm sure glad this happened, but there's going to be a deep-seated joy that our heart is doing what it's made to do. And we've gotten through it. And we're getting through it. When I say through it, there's no end to it, but we're getting through it. We're getting to that sadness. We've gotten through the stages. And we might get to a point where we can actually thank our shame, which sounds like a ridiculous thing we would want to do because it's likely caused us a lot of harm and a lot of anxiety and a lot of problems and a lot of acting out and a lot of drinking too much and a lot of other things that we regret. Why in the world would we thank our shame? And the phrasing I've heard is, it saved our lives. It gave us a pattern when we didn't know if we belonged or mattered. We created a slot for ourselves where for a time we did. And we had to. And we didn't have a choice. And in that time, it saved our lives. Unfortunately, in that time, it created a rut and a little path that we stayed in that stopped working. So, but we can have a relationship with this shame where we can say, okay, I see. And a big part of this process, I'm going to say, is being curious about ourselves. I'm getting close to wrapping up. But it's coming from the big difference in approaching it like this is being curious about ourselves and not saying, how could I? Like I said, we could even shame ourselves for having shame. Well, that's stupid to think I'm an idiot. Just, I have shame for feeling shame. That doesn't work, you know? But instead of saying, how could I? To say, oh, of course I did. Of course I felt shame like that. So when we get back to those stories, when we get back to the roots, when we get back to what's the earliest I remember feeling this way, and we start answering those questions, what happened, what changed, who was there, how did I feel? We might get to a point and we find that shame. We might get to a point where we can say, thank you for helping me survive. So again, to repeat a lot of what was in the fear, to name the shame like we name the fear. What does it say about us? Great question. What does the shame say about us? To listen to others, to hear our own stories, to make sure we feel, and to let others in. Unfortunately, and fortunately, this doesn't work as well when we're just doing it on our own. There's great, great power in sharing it with other people, and there's even a necessity to share it with other people. To see that we're safe, that we're normal, that we're accepted in all of this mess. It's very important in 12-step programs, which I talk about a lot, as you can tell. In 12-step programs, we have the 5th step, which all the 5th step is taking the 4th step where we just did this huge inventory on all these things and sharing it with someone else. Extremely important. And then, like I said, be compassionate and curious rather than saying, how could I? What was I thinking? What the hell's wrong with me? Being able to say, oh, okay, of course. One of my favorite quotes, there's no agony greater than bearing an untold story inside you. And for me, the biggest untold story was from here to here. You know, I knew the circumstances. I knew everything that happened. Now, there was big periods of time where I didn't talk about that. So in a way, that's almost like not knowing. But even when I began to talk about it, not knowing how I felt about it was an untold story. And it was an agony for me. I had a lot of pain when I started this. It came out on my windshield that one time. And it was physical. It was physical. When I started therapy, I think that was the first thing I ever said in the therapist's office is, I've got this pain right here. And it was just like, it was physical, but I knew it wasn't just physical. So my hope for us, do we have that inexplicable ache, that unnamed ache? You know, do you have that? If you do, maybe it's an untold story. So my hope for us is to find that story for healing, for courage, for peace, for reduced anxiety, for rest, for sleep, for joy, for laughter. But overall, for all this is to better relate with ourselves so that we can better relate to others as we're created to do. So thank you guys so much again for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, it means a lot for you guys to be here.